February 1944. A ravine south of Rome, 3 miles behind the German front line at Anzio. A battery of 4 105mm howitzers sits beneath camouflage netting strung between the trunks of umbrella pines. The guns have been here for 11 days. They have been dug in with care. The trails are sandbagged. The ammunition is stacked in covered pits. The battery commander, a Hauptmann with 2 years on the Eastern Front, has done everything the manual requires. He has positioned his guns in a natural fold of terrain invisible from the air. He has forbidden fires during daylight. He has staggered his salvos to avoid a predictable rhythm. He has even ordered his crews to sweep the ground behind the breach after every firing to hide the blast marks from aerial photography. By every doctrine he has been trained in, his guns are hidden. They fire at 07:15 hours, 4 rounds each. 16 shells aimed at the American perimeter near the Mussolini Canal. The crews reload. They wait. Exactly 4 minutes and 40 seconds after the last muzzle flash, before the gun crews have finished swabbing the bores, the ravine erupts. American shells, dozens of them, begin landing in a pattern so tight that the first salvo alone dismounts 1 howitzer and kills 3 men in its pit. The second salvo arrives 12 seconds later. Then a third. The battery commander, pressed flat against the wall of his dugout with dirt cascading onto his helmet, is not thinking about survival. He is thinking about a question. He has not moved his guns. He has not been spotted from the air. There has been no enemy patrol anywhere near his position. No one has betrayed his coordinates. He has done nothing differently than he did yesterday, or the day before, or the day before that. And yet the Americans have found him. They have found him to within what feels like 30 meters of his number 2 gun. He does not know how. He will never find out. What happened to that battery in the ravine? What happened to hundreds of German batteries across Italy, France, and Germany between 1943 and 1945 was the product of a weapon the Germans could not see, could not hear, and could not understand. It was not a new shell. It was not a new aeroplane. It was not a spy or a traitor. It was sound. The Americans had learned to listen to German guns firing and, from the sound alone, calculate the exact position of those guns to within 25 to 50 meters. They did it with microphones planted in the mud, wires strung across kilometers of battlefield, a strip of moving photographic film, and a handful of men whose civilian jobs before the war had been things like surveying coastlines, stringing telephone cables, and teaching college physics. The German artillerymen on the receiving end of this capability had a question. It was the same question in Italy. It was the same question in Normandy. It was the same question in the Ardennes and along the Rhine. The question was simple. How are they finding our guns? German prisoners asked it during interrogation. German officers wrote it in their field reports. German generals, in private conversations they believed no one else could hear, circled back to it again and again. They could not answer it. Not because the science was beyond them. The Germans had their own sound-ranging units, their own Beobachtungsabteilungen, trained at the Artillery Messschule at Warn, using the same basic acoustic principles. They understood that sound could locate a gun. What they could not understand was how the Americans were doing it so fast, so accurately, and with such devastating consequences. They could not understand because the answer was not about microphones. The answer was about a system, and the system was built on a foundation the Germans could see no part of from the inside of a bombardment. To understand how American crews found German guns by sound alone, and why the Germans could not explain it, we need to go back further than most people expect. Not to North Africa, not to Pearl Harbor, not even to the training ranges at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. We need to go back to 1914, to the Western Front, to the moment when artillery became invisible and the entire science of modern war changed. When the Great War settled into trench warfare in the autumn of 1914, the armies on the Western Front faced a problem that had never existed before in the history of armed conflict. For the first time, artillery was killing men by the tens of thousands from positions the men being killed could not see. The introduction of smokeless propellant in the 1880s had removed the telltale cloud of white smoke that had marked a gun's position since the invention of gunpowder. The development of indirect fire, shooting by map coordinates rather than line of sight, meant gun crews no longer needed to see their targets at all. They could sit behind a hill 3 miles from the front line, lob shells over the crest, and never expose themselves to observation. The effect was catastrophic. Over the course of the war, artillery would account for roughly 60% of all casualties on the Western Front. Hundreds of guns were firing from hidden positions into trenches full of men who had no idea where the shells were coming from. Finding those guns, the ones you could not see, became the single most important tactical problem of the war. Aerial photography helped, but aircraft were grounded by weather and shot down by fighters. Flash spotting, watching for the brief flicker of a muzzle flash at night or in poor light, worked sometimes but failed in fog, in rain, and against the growing use of flashless propellant. There was one thing, however, that the guns could never hide: their sound. Every gun, when it fires, produces 2 distinct acoustic signatures. The first is the shell wave, the miniature sonic boom created by the projectile as it travels faster than the speed of sound. The second is the muzzle wave, a deep, low-frequency pressure pulse that radiates outward from the gun itself at the speed of sound. The shell wave arrives first. It is sharp and high-pitched. The muzzle wave arrives second. It is slow and deep. And the muzzle wave, unlike the shell wave, travels in a predictable expanding sphere whose center is the gun. If you could isolate the muzzle wave, if you could record the exact moment it arrived at several different microphones spread across a known baseline, if you could measure the tiny differences in arrival time between those microphones, you could, using the geometry of hyperbolas, calculate where the gun was. The French moved first. In late 1914, Charles Nordman, an astronomer at the Meudon Observatory near Paris who was serving at the front, proposed the idea of using time differences between separated microphones to locate guns. He brought in Lucien Boulle, a chronophotographer and instrument maker at the Institut Marais in Paris, who had spent years building devices to record rapid physical events, including the electrical signals of the human heart. Boulle adapted the Eindhoven string galvanometer, originally a medical device for recording heartbeats, to record the signals from microphones on a strip of moving cinema film. A test at St. Cloud in November of 1914 located guns to within roughly 40 meters. The concept worked. Making it work reliably on a battlefield took another 2 years. A Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and a man who noticed something strange about a privy. The British, learning of the French experiments, assigned the problem to a small survey section at General Headquarters in Flanders. The officer given the task of making it work was a 25-year-old second lieutenant named William Lawrence Bragg. Bragg was not a typical junior officer. In November of 1915, he had shared the Nobel Prize in Physics with his father, William Henry Bragg, for their work on X-ray crystallography. He remains to this day the youngest person ever to receive a scientific Nobel Prize. Bragg attacked the problem, the way a physicist attacks any problem. He identified the variables, isolated the errors, and designed experiments to eliminate them. His first challenge was the microphones. The standard carbon microphones his team was using responded most strongly to the sharp, high-frequency shell wave rather than the slow, low-frequency muzzle wave. This was a disaster because the shell wave originated from a moving projectile, not from the stationary gun. If you timed the shell wave, you got the trajectory. If you timed the muzzle wave, you got the gun. The breakthrough came from a corporal named William Sansom Tucker. Tucker was billeted in a drafty shack made of tarred paper near a British 6-inch gun battery. He noticed that every time the nearby guns fired, a pulse of cold air pushed through small holes in the walls of his shack. There is a famous detail, recorded by Bragg himself, that deserves preserving. Bragg noted that anyone sitting on the outdoor latrine near that battery was slightly but perceptibly lifted off the seat when the 6-inch gun fired. It was proof of a powerful, low-frequency pressure wave that the ear could barely hear, but the body could certainly feel. Tucker took this observation and turned it into a device. He stretched a fine, electrically heated platinum wire, known as a Wollaston wire, across a hole in an ammunition box. When the low-frequency muzzle wave passed over the wire, the moving air cooled it. The cooling changed the wire's electrical resistance, which was recorded by the galvanometer. The high-frequency shell wave, being too rapid to cool the wire, barely registered. Tucker had built a filter. He had built a microphone that heard only the thing that mattered, the gun itself, and ignored everything else. By September of 1916, every British sound ranging section on the Western Front had the Tucker microphone. The mature system arrayed 6 Tucker microphones along a shallow arc, roughly 7,000 meters wide, several thousand yards behind the front line, connected by miles of fine wire to a central recording station. A forward observer near the trenches watched for the flash of an enemy gun and pressed a key that started the recording film. As the muzzle wave swept across the arc, each microphone tripped its galvanometer element in sequence, leaving a distinct mark on the moving film. A timing wheel printed reference lines so the operators could measure the differences in arrival time to within about 1/100th of a second. Those time differences were then plotted as hyperbolas on a gridded board. The gun was at the point where the hyperbolas intersected. It sounds simple. It was not. The speed of sound changes with temperature. Wind bends the wavefront. Humidity alters propagation. The curvature of the Earth matters over distances of several kilometers. Every one of those variables had to be measured and corrected for. But when the corrections were right, the system was devastating. In March of 1917, the British General Staff reported that a single sound-ranging section had located 260 German batteries in 2 months. At Vimy Ridge in April of 1917, Canadian forces under Lieutenant Colonel Andrew McNaughton used sound and flash ranging to neutralize the majority of German guns before the assault, contributing to one of the most famous victories of the entire war. The Germans knew they were being heard. A captured German order forbade batteries from firing alone, hoping that simultaneous fire from multiple guns would confuse the system. Bragg was untroubled. He claimed his arc could locate almost any number of guns firing at once. The more the merrier, he said. The Americans adopted the British system directly. The American Expeditionary Force's Sound and Flash Ranging Service was organized by Major Augustus Trowbridge, a physicist from Princeton, and Captain Theodore Lyman, a physicist from Harvard. They established a training school at Fort de Saint-Meng near Langres and fielded 4 sound-ranging sections by the end of the war. Jesse R. Hinman's Sound Ranging Section No. 1 was the first American unit to reach the front. At the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, Hinman's section located a German gun hidden in dense woods that aerial photography could not confirm. The infantry initially dismissed the location as an error. When troops overran the position, they found the gun exactly where the sound rangers had said it was. A post-war American study found that roughly 80% of German battery positions on the sectors they covered had been identified by sound ranging, with accuracy in ideal conditions of 10 to 25 meters. The Americans knew the science worked. They wrote it down. They filed it. And then, for 20 years, most of them forgot about it. When the United States entered the Second World War, sound ranging was a known capability. It had been proven. It had been documented. It existed in manuals and training syllabi at Fort Sill. What it did not have was an army that knew how to use it in a real fight against a real enemy that was shooting back. The first time American artillery faced the Wehrmacht in force was at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February of 1943. It was a disaster. German forces under General Major Friedrich von Broich and elements of the 10th Panzer Division smashed through the American Second Corps in 6 days. 6,500 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. More than 200 tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. American artillery was present. American observation battalions were in the theater. But the system, the integrated web of survey, observation, calculation, and massed fire that would later become the most feared weapon in the American arsenal, did not yet exist in practice. It existed on paper. It existed in the manuals. It did not exist in the field. The gun crews were green. The surveyors had not yet learned to work under fire. The fire direction centers, the nerve centers that were supposed to take a location from a sound-ranging section and convert it into coordinated fire from multiple battalions, were slow and uncoordinated. The Germans looked at Kasserine and saw what their intelligence analysts had been telling them. The Americans had material. They did not have method. They had wealth. They did not have warcraft. German officers dismissed the Americans as amateurs, whose only advantage was their factories, and after Kasserine, the dismissal seemed earned. Here is the thing you need to hold on to, the thing that makes the rest of this investigation extraordinary. Within 12 months of Kasserine, on the same continent, against the same enemy, American artillery had become so accurate, so fast, and so devastating that German commanders would attribute the failure of entire offensives to a single cause. Not American tanks, not American infantry, American artillery fire. The transformation was not gradual. It was violent and fast, born out of humiliation and driven by men who learned from the disaster and refused to repeat it. After Kasserine, the American Second Corps was reorganized under Major General George S. Patton, and then under Major General Omar Bradley. The observation battalions retrained. The surveyors learned to work faster and under worse conditions. The fire direction centers drilled until the conversion of a sound fix into a firing command became a matter of minutes, not hours. The communication procedures were tightened. The entire counter-battery chain, from the microphone in the mud to the shell leaving the muzzle, was compressed and hardened by men who had seen what happened when the chain was slow and loose. What had changed was not the equipment. The guns were the same. The microphones were the same. The film recorders were the same. What had changed was the system around them and the men inside that system, and where those men had come from before they ever put on a uniform. January of 1944, the Anzio beachhead, 50 miles south of Rome. If you wanted to design a laboratory to test whether sound ranging worked under the worst possible conditions, you could not have done better than Anzio. The beachhead was 15 miles wide and 7 miles deep. Every square meter of it was under German observation from the Alban Hills to the north. German artillery, including heavy 170mm rifles, 210mm howitzers, and the infamous Krupp K5 railroad guns that the Americans nicknamed Anzio Annie, poured fire into the perimeter day and night. The Americans could not advance. The Germans could not push them into the sea. The result was a 5-month artillery duel fought at ranges where sound ranging became not a convenience, but a necessity. Flash ranging was degraded by smoke and haze. Aerial observation was limited by German anti-aircraft, fire and weather, but sound travelled through all of it. The Field Artillery Observation Battalions at Anzio, including elements of the 1st FAOB, which would ultimately spend more than 900 days in the line across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France, set up their sound bases in the cramped perimeter and went to work. The process was methodical, painstaking, and invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. First, the surveyors went forward. They had to establish the exact coordinates of each microphone position to within roughly a meter, because any error in the baseline propagated directly into an error in the computed gun position. They did this with theodolites, measuring tapes, and trigonometric calculations, often under shellfire, often at night, often crawling on their stomachs to avoid being seen. Once the microphones were placed and the wires were run back to the recording station, the section waited. When a German gun fired, the forward observer at the advance post, positioned close to the front, heard the report or saw the flash and pressed a key. The key started the photographic film rolling in the recorder. A fraction of a second later, the muzzle wave, expanding outward from the German gun at roughly 340 meters per second, reached the first microphone, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, fifth, and sixth, each one a few hundredths of a second after the last. Each microphone's signal deflected its galvanometer wire, leaving a small blip on the moving film. The operators developed the film, measured the time differences between the blips using the reference marks from the timing wheel, and plotted the hyperbolas on a gridded computation board. The intersection gave them a 6-figure grid coordinate. They telephoned the coordinate to the Fire Direction Center. The Fire Direction Center calculated firing data for the American guns assigned to counter battery work. And then came the part the Germans felt. Multiple American batteries, sometimes an entire battalion of 12 guns, sometimes more, opened fire simultaneously in what was called time on target, a technique in which the firing data was calculated so that every shell from every gun, despite different ranges and trajectories, arrived at the target at the same instant. The first warning a German gun crew had was the sound of the incoming rounds. By then it was too late. At Anzio, this system produced results that stunned the German command. During the major German counterattack of February 16th through 20th, 1944, Allied artillery outshot the German artillery by a ratio of roughly 10-1. The United States Army's official history of the Anzio beachhead records that accurate artillery fire drove back the first German assault force in a state of disorder bordering on panic. The Germans themselves acknowledged that the counterattacks launched by the Hermann Göring Panzer Division in early February had been badly disrupted by the demoralizing effect of Allied artillery fire. There was a man at Anzio, and in Tunisia before it, and in Sicily and southern France after it, whose name almost nobody knows, and whose contribution to the American artillery system was as important as any general's. His name was David Whipp. Before the war, Whipp had been an officer of the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey, a civilian agency whose job was to measure the physical shape of the United States, its coastlines, its mountains, its rivers, its tidal patterns. It was precise, unglamorous, technically demanding work. It required a man to spend weeks in remote terrain with a theodolite and a set of logarithm tables, measuring angles and distances to fractions of a second of arc, building the invisible triangulation networks that underpin every accurate map. When the war came, Whipp and 25 other Coast and Geodetic Survey officers were detailed to the Field Artillery as survey officers. Their job was to build the survey framework that tied every American gun, every observation post, every microphone, and every target to a single common grid. Without that framework, the Fire Direction Center could not function. Without the Fire Direction Center, time on target was impossible. Without time on target, sound ranging was just an interesting science experiment. Whipp was assigned to the 1st Field Artillery Observation Battalion. At El Gheta, Tunisia, in March of 1943, barely a month after the Kasserine disaster, he did something that earned him the Silver Star. His citation reads that with complete disregard for his own safety, Lieutenant Whipp proceeded in advance of the infantry to establish survey control for all of the artillery 2 days prior to the attack. Despite heavy enemy shellfire, read that again, he went ahead of the infantry, not behind them, not with them, ahead of them. He went forward into ground the infantry had not yet taken, under German shellfire, with a theodolite and a measuring tape, to lay the survey points that would allow the guns behind him to fire accurately when the attack began. He did this because the survey had to be in place before the guns could shoot, and the only way to get it in place was for someone to go out there and do it. Whipp completed his war with 924 days in the line, believed to be among the longest continuous combat records of any American soldier in the European theatre. He was awarded the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and the French Croix de Guerre with Gold Star. He wrote letters home that survive in the historical record. In one, he described eating from the mess kit of a dead German soldier because his own had been lost. In another, he described the cold, the fear, the sound of shells on roads he had to drive at night with no headlights to reach a forward survey station. He was proud, according to the historian Albert Theberg, that not one of the men under his command was captured during the entire war. David Whipp was not a general. He was not an infantryman. He was a man who had spent his civilian career measuring coastlines, and when his country asked him to measure battlefields instead, he did it the same way, with precision, under pressure, without waiting to be told. The German reports from Anzio and the Italian campaign kept returning to the same phenomenon. Their gun positions were being found and destroyed faster than they could displace. Their counterattacks were being broken up by artillery fire that arrived on their assembly areas before the attacks could begin. Their battery commanders were reporting that American counter-battery fire was landing with an accuracy that presupposed either aerial observation, which the weather frequently denied, or ground observation, which the terrain made impossible, or something else entirely. The something else was sound. But when captured German artillerymen were interrogated about their understanding of American counter-battery methods, the answers revealed a peculiar gap. The German army had its own sound-ranging units. They knew the science. What they did not grasp was the system that surrounded it. They did not understand the survey network that made it accurate. They did not understand the fire direction center that made it fast. They did not understand time on target, which made it lethal. They experienced the effect without being able to see the cause. It was as if they were being hit by lightning from a clear sky and could not find the cloud. The pattern repeated in Normandy. When Allied forces broke out of the beachheads in the summer of 1944, American artillery followed the advance with a counter-battery capability that the Germans had not encountered in North Africa and were not prepared for in France. The conditions were radically different from Anzio. At Anzio, the beachhead was static. The sound bases could be laid once and maintained for weeks. In Normandy, the fighting was mobile. The hedgerow country of the bocage broke the battlefield into thousands of small enclosed fields, bordered by earthen banks 4 feet high and topped with ancient root systems that made every field a separate tactical problem. The observation battalions had to adapt. The 7th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, which had trained for 3 years before landing in Normandy in July of 1944, became the primary counter-battery unit of Patton's 20th Corps. The 7th had been formed on the eve of Pearl Harbor and had spent an unusually long period in stateside training, drilling the sound and flash-ranging process until the crews could set up a base, record a shot, computer fix, and transmit a coordinate with a speed that peacetime training had never demanded. In the bocage, they laid shorter baselines because the terrain would not permit the standard 7-kilometer arc. They moved more frequently because the front moved daily. They worked alongside flash-ranging platoons, which triangulated muzzle flashes from surveyed observation posts on the rare hilltops and church steeples that gave a view over the hedgerows, and with aerial observation when weather permitted. The result was the same. German batteries were found and silenced. Captured German officers in France repeatedly remarked on the heavy volume of American fire and on its accuracy, but what they could not account for was the speed. A German battery would fire, and within minutes, sometimes within 4 or 5 minutes, American counter-battery fire would arrive on their position. The Germans understood that locating a gun by sound took time. Setting up microphones, recording the shot, developing the film, plotting the hyperbolas, computing the coordinates, transmitting them to the guns, calculating firing data, loading, and firing. By their own experience with their Beobachtungsabteilungen, this process should have taken much longer than the Americans seemed to need. What the Germans did not know was that the American system had been compressed at every link in the chain. The survey was already in place, maintained continuously by the observation battalion surveyors, who moved with the advance and who updated the grid control daily, so that no microphone position was ever more than a few hours old. The fire direction center had been drilled until the conversion from coordinates to firing commands was nearly automatic. The American FDC was a radically efficient node. A single officer could receive a coordinate, assign it to a firing battery, compute the deflection and elevation, and issue the command in a continuous flow that the German system, with its more formal separation of functions, could not replicate at the same speed. The communications net, built on American field telephones and wire that the signal corps strung forward as fast as the infantry moved, was faster and more reliable than anything the German artillery communications system could match. American wire was abundant. German wire was rationed. American switchboards connected every battery to every observation post through a web of redundant circuits. German communications, increasingly damaged by air attack and short of replacement cable, grew thinner and slower as the war went on. The entire chain, from the moment a German gun fired to the moment American shells landed on it, had been shortened to something the German system could not replicate. And the Germans could not see where the time was being saved because the time was being saved everywhere at once, in 100 small efficiencies, performed by men who were not following a doctrine of speed, but who had simply gotten very good at their jobs. Then came December of 1944 and the Ardennes. The German offensive that began on December 16th caught the Americans by surprise along a 75-mile front. The weather was terrible. Fog, snow, and low cloud grounded the Allied air forces that had been the dominant counter-battery tool in clear weather. Flash ranging was degraded by the flat grey light that swallowed muzzle flashes before the observers could triangulate them. Aerial observation was impossible. For the first time since the Italian campaign, the American artillery was fighting without its eyes in the sky. These were exactly the conditions in which sound ranging proved its deepest value, because sound does not care about fog, sound does not care about snow, sound does not care about cloud cover. If anything, cold, dense winter air enhanced sound propagation, carrying the muzzle wave farther and more clearly than the warm, turbulent air of summer. A gun that might have been difficult to locate in the shimmering convection of a July afternoon registered with sharp, clean traces on a December morning when the air was still and frozen, and the sound travelled in a straight line without bending. The observation battalions in the Ardennes, including the 16th FAOB and elements of the 8th FAOB, were caught in the centre of the German breakthrough. Their men were not infantry. They were technicians, surveyors, telephone operators, mathematicians. They carried sidearms and carbines, not rifles. They were not trained for close combat. They had no tanks, no heavy weapons, and no armour of any kind. And yet they held their positions, maintained their sound bases, and continued providing counter-battery locations, even as German forces pushed past them on both flanks. The wire was cut by shellfire and they crawled out to repair it. The microphones were buried by snow and they dug them out. The recording stations were threatened by German patrols, and they posted guards with carbines and kept the film rolling. According to one account, a veteran of the 16th named Keith Davis recalled that a paratrooper from the 101st Airborne asked him where the front line was. Davis told him, "You are standing on it." That line, spoken by a sound-ranging technician to a combat paratrooper, captures something essential about the observation battalions. They were never behind the lines because the lines kept moving through them. They did their work in the space between the infantry and the enemy, and they did it with microphones instead of machine guns. There is a detail about the observation battalions in the Ardennes that belongs in this account because it explains something about the kind of men they were. When the breakthrough began and units all around them were falling back or being overrun, the observation battalions did not have a clear withdrawal order. They were not a priority for headquarters that was trying to plug a 75-mile gap with divisions that did not yet exist in the sector. So they stayed, not because they had been ordered to stay, because the sound bases were in place and the wires were laid and the microphones were working, and if they left, the counter-battery capability left with them. They stayed because the system needed them to stay, and they understood the system. And they understood what happened to infantry when the guns firing on them could not be found and silenced. There is a story from the First World War that I have already told you, the story of Corporal Tucker and the heated wire and the latrine, that I want to return to now for a different reason. Tucker was not an officer. He was not a trained acoustician. He was a British corporal who noticed something strange about the way cold air moved through holes in his shack when a gun fired, and who turned that observation into a device that changed the way wars are fought. He did not ask permission. He did not submit a proposal through channels. He built a prototype out of an ammunition box and a strand of wire, tested it, and showed it to Bragg. Bragg, a Nobel laureate, looked at the work of a corporal and immediately recognized its value. The Tucker microphone became the foundation of every sound-ranging system used by every Allied army for the next 30 years. I tell you about Tucker because his story is the story of the American observation battalions in miniature, just from the other side of the Atlantic and a generation earlier. The Americans who manned the sound and flash-ranging sections of the Second World War were, overwhelmingly, men whose civilian skills translated directly into military capability. The surveyors came from the Coast and Geodetic Survey and from civilian engineering firms. They knew how to set up a theodolite, run a traverse, close a triangle, and compute coordinates before they ever saw a military manual. The wire men and telephone operators came from the Bell system, from Western Electric, from rural telephone cooperatives across the Midwest. They knew how to string wire, splice cable, maintain a circuit, and troubleshoot a connection in bad weather. The men who read the film and computed the plots were often college students, sometimes physics or mathematics majors, who could handle logarithms and trigonometry without reaching for a textbook. The men who maintained the galvanometers and the recording equipment had worked on radios, on phonographs, on the electrical systems of automobiles and farm machinery. This was not an accident. It was not a deliberate recruitment strategy either. It was a reflection of the country that produced these men. The United States in the 1930s and 1940s was a nation of practical problem solvers. It was a country where a farm boy in Iowa had been maintaining a diesel tractor since the age of 14, where a telephone lineman in rural Pennsylvania could climb a pole in an ice storm and restore service to a county with nothing but a pair of pliers and a roll of tape, where a college sophomore at a land-grant university could build a radio receiver from mail-order parts in his dormitory room, where a surveyor from the Coast and Geodetic Survey had spent 10 summers on the coast of Alaska or the bayous of Louisiana, measuring tidal benchmarks in conditions that made a battlefield look comfortable, where a switchboard operator in a small-town exchange knew every circuit, every relay, and every junction box in 3 counties, and could trace a fault by ear, listening to the tone on the wire the way a mechanic listens to an engine. These habits, the habit of measuring, the habit of fixing, the habit of figuring it out with whatever was at hand, did not disappear when the men put on uniforms. They became the invisible foundation of the American artillery system. The survey network that made sound ranging accurate was built by men who had been surveying before the army taught them anything. The communication network that made it fast was maintained by men who had been stringing wire before they knew what a fire direction center was. The calculations that turned sound into a grid coordinate were performed by men who had been solving equations before they learned to salute. The German army had its own observation battalions. They were well trained. Their equipment was comparable. Their scientists had contributed to the same body of acoustic knowledge that Bragg and Tucker had drawn on. The German Beobachtungsabteilungen had been reconstituted from the First World War Schallmestrupps, the original sound-measuring troops, and trained at a dedicated school at Warn. In coastal defense applications, German sound ranging achieved accuracy on the order of 50 meters, comparable to the Allied systems. But the German system sat on a different cultural foundation. The German conscript of 1943 had not grown up splicing telephone cable on a Kansas fence line. He had not built a crystal radio set in a boarding school dormitory. He had grown up in a society that drew sharper lines between the man who designed and the man who operated, between the engineer and the technician, between the officer who understood the system and the enlisted man who turned the crank. The German observation battalions functioned. They located guns. But they did not produce the same density of improvisation, the same depth of practical competence at the lowest level that the American battalions did. When an American microphone failed in the field, the crew fixed it. When a wire was cut by shellfire, the lineman went out and spliced it, sometimes under fire, sometimes at night, sometimes 3 or 4 times in the same hour. When the computation did not look right, the man reading the film questioned it, rechecked it, and corrected it, not because he had been ordered to, but because he knew what a wrong number meant. It meant shells landing on empty ground while German guns kept firing. The system ran on trust. The officer trusted the surveyor's coordinates. The fire direction center trusted the sound section's plot. The gun crews trusted the firing data. And all of that trust was built on the knowledge that the man at the bottom of the chain, the man with the theodolite, the man with the splice kit, the man with the film reader, knew what he was doing because he had been doing something like it his entire life. There was a second reason the Germans could not match the American counter-battery system, and it had nothing to do with skill or culture. It had to do with what was happening inside the German army itself. By 1944, the Wehrmacht's artillery was being strangled by 3 forces it could not control. The first was ammunition. On the Eastern Front, and increasingly in the West, German ammunition production was being sabotaged by the slave laborers and prisoners of war who were forced to work in the factories. At Anzio, roughly 70% of the German 170mm shells fired at the beachhead were duds, 70%. 7 out of every 10 shells hit the ground and did not explode because someone in a forced labor camp had deliberately left out a detonator component or reversed a fuse assembly. The men who did this, nameless prisoners working under armed guard in underground plants, were fighting a war of their own. Every dud shell they produced was a life saved on the Allied side. The Americans did not know this at the time. They only knew that German shellfire, while terrifying, was not producing the casualties it should have. They attributed it to poor German quality control. It was, in fact, one of the most effective acts of industrial sabotage in the history of modern warfare. The second force was air supremacy. By the summer of 1944, Allied fighter bombers owned the sky over the Western Front. German batteries that fired during daylight risked being spotted by air observation and attacked within minutes. German ammunition convoys moving forward were strafed and destroyed on the roads. German guns that displaced to new positions were caught in the open. The result was that German artillery in Normandy was firing at roughly 10% of the volume that British and American batteries were firing. 10%. A German battery that might have fired 100 rounds a day in 1941 was now rationed to 10. The third force was the loss of experienced men. The Eastern Front had consumed the German artillery corps the way it had consumed every other branch. The trained surveyors, the experienced observation officers, the veteran battery commanders who knew how to read terrain and pick positions and displace under pressure, were dead or captured or transferred to shattered infantry divisions that needed any warm body that could hold a rifle. The replacements were younger, less trained, and operating in a system that was losing its institutional memory. The German artillery of 1944 was not the German artillery of 1940. It looked the same on paper. It was not the same in the field. In May of 1944, on the Italian front, south of Cassino, the American counter-battery system produced a moment that captures its full power in a single action. The Allied spring offensive, Operation Diadem, was planned for May 11th. In the weeks before the attack, the 1st Field Artillery Observation Battalion, the same unit David Whipp served in, made a deliberate and cold-blooded decision. They did not fire on the German batteries they located. They logged them. Every sound-ranging fix, every flash observation, every confirmed position went into a growing target list that the sound and flash crews maintained on a gridded map in the battalion command post. They let the German guns fire freely, accepting the casualties that came with it, because every shot the Germans fired was another data point on the plot. A gun that fired once gave a probable location. A gun that fired 10 times from the same position gave a confirmed one. By the morning of May 11th, the observation battalion had built a comprehensive map of the German artillery positions across their sector, a map that the Germans did not know existed, drawn not by spies or aircraft but by the sound of their own firing. When the offensive began, the American and Allied guns opened fire on every position simultaneously. The German batteries that had been firing with impunity for weeks were smothered in a single coordinated barrage. They had been located by the sound of their own firing, tracked over days and weeks, and destroyed in minutes. It was not a battle. It was an execution planned by men with microphones and carried out by men with howitzers. The German guns never saw it coming because there was nothing to see. There were no enemy observers on the hilltops. There were no aircraft overhead in the darkness before the barrage. There were only microphones in the mud, wires running back to a recording station, and a strip of photographic film that had been quietly accumulating the coordinates of every gun that dared to fire. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, writing about the Western Front in 1944, described what his forces faced in terms that have become some of the most quoted passages in the literature of the Second World War. He wrote of the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery and even more in the air. He wrote of their outstandingly large supply of ammunition. He did not write about sound ranging. He did not write about observation battalions or microphones or hyperbolic computation. He wrote about effects. He wrote about what it felt like to command an army whose guns were being silenced by an enemy that seemed to know where every battery was. These words survive in what was later published as the Rommel Papers, edited after his death, and they are the closest thing we have to a confession from the most famous German field commander in the West. General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin, the German corps commander at Cassino, wrote in his memoir, titled Neither Fear Nor Hope, about the overwhelming weight of Allied artillery and its demoralizing effect on his troops. He described a situation in which German batteries could not fire without drawing immediate and devastating retaliation, a situation in which the act of shooting had become, for a German gun crew, the act of revealing yourself to be killed. He wrote about this with the clinical precision of a professional officer who understood that his army was being outfought not by braver soldiers, but by a better system, and who had the honesty to say so when most of his peers did not. Neither Rommel nor von Senger identified the mechanism. They described the symptom. The American shells arrived. The German guns were silenced. How the Americans knew where to shoot remained, to the men on the receiving end, something close to a mystery. It was not a mystery. It was physics, plus survey, plus organization, plus a country full of men who knew how to measure things. So here is the answer to the question that German artillerymen kept asking across 3 years and 4 theatres of war. How are they finding our guns? They were finding them with sound. They were finding them with 6 microphones and a strip of film and a set of hyperbolic equations that a college sophomore could solve. But that was only the mechanism. The reason the mechanism worked, the reason it worked fast enough and accurately enough to destroy a battery before it could displace, was everything around it. It was the survey network built by men from the Coast and Geodetic Survey who had spent their careers measuring the shape of the Earth. It was the Fire Direction Center, manned by officers, who had drilled the conversion of coordinates to firing data until it was reflex. It was the communication net maintained by telephone men who had been splicing wire since before the war. It was the time-on-target technique that concentrated the fire of a dozen batteries into a single simultaneous impact. It was the ammunition, reliable and abundant, produced by factories that had not been bombed and by workers who had not been enslaved. It was, in the end, a system. And the system was built by ordinary men whose ordinary civilian skills turned out to be, in the specific conditions of this war, exactly the skills that mattered most. The Germans could not explain it because there was no single thing to explain. There was no secret weapon. There was no wonder device. There was a country that had produced, almost by accident, a generation of practical men who could survey a baseline under shellfire, splice a wire in the dark, read a galvanometer trace in a tent lit by a kerosene lamp, and compute a firing solution on a board with a pencil and a set of tables, and who did all of it not because they had been ordered to, but because they understood what it was for. The German artillerymen who asked how are they finding our guns were asking the wrong question. The right question was not how, the right question was who. Who were these men with the microphones and the theodolites and the wire reels, these men who were not infantry, not tankers, not pilots, not the soldiers who appear in the photographs and the films and the history books? They were the men of the Field Artillery Observation Battalions. By the end of the war, there were 25 of them, with roughly 13,000 men. Most of their names are in no history book. Most of their stories have never been told. They did not charge beaches. They did not fly bombers. They did not liberate camps. They sat in holes in the ground with headphones and film recorders, and they listened. And because they listened, German guns that had been firing with impunity were found and silenced. German attacks that had been massed in hidden assembly areas were broken up before they began. German artillerymen who had done everything right, who had camouflaged and sandbagged and staggered their fire and followed every procedure in the manual, were killed by shells that arrived from a direction they were not looking and aimed by men they never saw. There is one more story that belongs in this investigation. On December 17, 1944, the second day of the German Ardennes offensive, a convoy of American soldiers was moving south through Belgium, near a crossroads called Bourgnes, just outside the town of Malmedy. The convoy belonged to Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. They were sound and flash-ranging men, technicians, surveyors, the men who listened for guns. The convoy was intercepted by Kampfgruppe Piper, a spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper. Approximately 113 American soldiers of Battery B were captured. They were disarmed. They were marched into a field. And then they were shot. 84 of them were murdered after surrendering in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre, one of the most notorious war crimes committed against American prisoners in the entire European theatre. The men who were killed that afternoon were not combat soldiers in the way the term is usually understood. They were the men who made the counter-battery system work. They were the listeners. They were the measurers. They were the men with the microphones. And they were killed not by the German guns they had spent the war locating, but by SS troops who did not know and did not care what an observation battalion was. Survivors, including a soldier named Ted Paluk, lived to bear witness. Their accounts were part of the evidence presented at the war crimes trials that followed. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it helps the story of men like the crew of Battery B reach the people who should hear it. That matters more than I can say. If your father or grandfather served in an observation battalion or in any artillery unit in the Second World War, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What unit were they with? Where did they serve? What did they remember? Those details, the small, personal, specific things, are the real history. They are what the official records leave out, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. The battery commander in the opening of this investigation is not named because he is not one man. The scene is reconstructed from documented reports of what happened to German batteries at Anzio when American counter-battery fire found them. The details are drawn from standard German artillery practice and from the United States Army's official history of the beachhead. The experience described, guns found and destroyed within minutes of firing from concealed positions, happened to hundreds of German batteries across 3 years of war. Every other person named in this account is real. The men of the Field Artillery Observation Battalions did not win the war by themselves. No single arm wins a war, but they gave the American artillery something the German artillery could not match and could not explain. They gave it ears. They gave it the ability to find a hidden gun by the sound of its own firing and to destroy it before it could fire again. They did this with equipment that a civilian radio technician could have maintained, and with mathematics that a college freshman could have performed, and with skills they had learned not in the army but in the country that raised them. The German gunners who asked how they are finding us were asking about physics. The answer was not physics. The answer was a survey officer from the Coast and Geodetic Survey, crawling forward under shellfire with a theodolite. The answer was a telephone lineman from Kansas, splicing wire in a ditch at 3 in the morning. The answer was a 22-year-old college student reading a strip of film in a blacked-out tent and plotting hyperbolas by lamplight and getting the intersection right to within 30 meters, because he understood that 30 meters was the difference between a dead German gun and a live one that would keep killing Americans. The answer was a system, and the system was made of men, and the men were made of a country that had taught them, long before the war, that when something needed measuring, you measured it. When something needed fixing, you fixed it. When something needed figuring out, you figured it out. You did not wait for someone to tell you. You did not defer to someone above you. You did the thing because it needed doing, and because you were the one who was there. The Germans built magnificent guns. They built superb optics. They wrote brilliant tactical manuals. They trained their officers in a tradition of military excellence that stretched back 200 years. And they lost the artillery war to men with microphones in the mud because the men with the microphones in the mud understood something that no manual could teach. They understood that the system only worked if the man at the bottom did his job as if the entire war depended on it. Because it did. And they did. And the German guns fell silent, one by one, battery by battery, across Italy and France and Belgium and Germany, silenced by a sound they made themselves and by men they never saw and by a country they never understood. If this investigation gave you something to think about, subscribe for the next chapter. There are many of these stories. Most of them are about men you have never heard of, in units that never made the headlines, who did work that never looked heroic in a photograph, but without which the armies that did make the headlines could not have fought. They had names. They came from somewhere. They went back to ordinary lives after the war, and most of them never told anyone what they had done. They deserve to be remembered not for what they destroyed, but for what they built, an invisible system of sound and wire and calculation that found the guns the enemy thought were hidden and proved. In field after field and hedgerow after hedgerow and frozen clearing after frozen clearing, that in this war, nothing that fired could hide for long.